The story begins on October 14, 2017, in the small town of Brookhaven, Mississippi. A quiet, deeply religious town where faith wasn't just a belief, it was the foundation of society. It dictated how people lived, how they spoke, how they raised their children. And no man held more power over this town than Pastor Samuel Mitchell. For over 20 years, Pastor Mitchell had stood at the pulpit of Grace of Light Church, preaching with fire and conviction. His sermons weren't gentle reminders, they were commandments. He did not speak of righteousness, he enforced it. To his congregation, he was more than a spiritual leader. He was a shepherd. And his people, his flock, were expected to obey. But Pastor Mitchell's power didn't just come from faith, it came from fear. His authority was absolute. He spoke of salvation and damnation as though he held the keys to both. In a town where everyone's reputation hinged on devotion to God, no one dared question him. He saw morality in black and white, with no room for defiance. And there was no tolerance for defiance. Yet in his own home, where he expected unwavering devotion, something threatened the very foundation of everything he had built, his son. Ethan Mitchell, 19 years old, had spent his entire life under his father's rule. He had absorbed every lesson, every warning about what it meant to live a righteous life. He was raised to be the perfect Christian son, obedient, disciplined, devoted to God. From the outside, Ethan was everything his father wanted him to be. But I've seen people wear masks before. People who live pretending to be something they're not, just to survive. And Ethan Mitchell was living a lie. I often wonder when he first realized it, the moment he felt the creeping dread that something inside him didn't align with everything he'd been taught. Because Ethan was different. He didn't want to be. He prayed harder than anyone. He memorized every scripture, repeated every verse about purity, about the natural order. But no matter how much he tried to deny it, one truth remained. He didn't fit into the world his father had built. And in a place like this, in a home like his, that wasn't just terrifying, it was dangerous. I think about how much of Ethan's life was spent in fear. Not of hell, but of the man who sat across from him at the dinner table every night. Pastor Mitchell had one expectation of his son, to be a reflection of himself. One day, Ethan would follow in his footsteps, lead the church, and uphold the values his father preached. And Ethan? He knew that if his father ever saw him for who he truly was, he would never look at him the same again. So he hid. He forced himself to laugh at the jokes his friends made in youth group. He bowed his head, whispered amen when his father condemned temptation. He sat through sermons that twisted his stomach into knots, nodding along as his father spoke about what was unnatural, what was an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. And he prayed. He prayed every night for God to fix him. Because that's what he'd been told his entire life, that what he felt wasn't real. That it was a test, a sickness, a trick from the devil himself. He truly believed that if he prayed hard enough, if he repented enough, God would take this burden away from him. But the prayers never worked. And no matter how much he tried to suppress it, the truth remained. There was something inside of him he couldn't change. And one day, he would no longer be able to hide it. But for now, he played his part, the perfect son, the perfect Christian. But secrets have a way of unraveling. In this town, in this church, even the smallest cracks can bring a house crashing down. Ethan Mitchell's mask would not last forever. And when it finally broke, the man who had sworn to love him, his own father, would become his greatest enemy. If you've enjoyed the story so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support truly means the world to us. Ethan had spent his entire life hiding, but everything changed the day he met Caleb Parker. It started small, a glance across the church, a shared smile. Caleb was new to Brookhaven, having moved from Louisiana with his mother after the divorce. He was different from the other boys in the youth group, outspoken, confident, and unapologetically himself. Ethan had never met anyone like him before. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself it was nothing, just admiration for a friend. But admiration didn't make his heart race. It didn't make him feel alive in a way he never had before. Caleb was kind. He didn't carry the same weight of fear that Ethan did. Caleb spoke about the world as if there was more to life than just following rules and expectations. And then, one night, it happened. They were sitting outside behind the church after an evening service, the warm Mississippi air thick with the scent of pine and summer rain. They had been talking, about everything, about nothing. And then there was a silence. A silence that felt different. Caleb looked at him, really looked at him, as though he could see every part of Ethan that he had spent years trying to bury. And then, before Ethan could stop himself, before he could think of all the reasons why it was wrong, he kissed him. The moment their lips met, the world shifted. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt free. But freedom is dangerous in a place built on control. At first, Ethan tried to push Caleb away. Guilt gnawed at him, and he spent nights praying for God to take it back, to erase the feeling. But he couldn't. Because for the first time, he wasn't praying out of fear. He was praying because he didn't want to lose what he had found. And so, they met in secret. Stolen moments behind the church, whispered words of love when no one was listening. With Caleb, Ethan didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to force himself into a role that didn't fit. For the first time, he could just be. But nothing stays hidden forever. Ethan was careful. But in a town like Brookhaven, people noticed things. A touch that lingered too long. A look that held too much meaning. And one day, someone saw them. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. For the rumors to reach the wrong ears. By the time Ethan got home that evening, his father was waiting for him. The house was silent, but something in the air felt cold. And then came the question. Is there something you want to tell me, son? Ethan had spent his whole life rehearsing lies to avoid this moment. But when he looked at his father, at the man who had spent his life preaching about honesty, he realized something. He was tired of lying. So, for the first time, he told the truth. I love him. His father's face didn't change. Not at first. But something in his eyes did. Something dark. Pastor Mitchell didn't speak. He just stared at his son, as if seeing a stranger. As if everything he had built, everything he believed in, had been shattered. And then, the words came. You are not my son. Ethan tried to explain. He tried to make his father understand that love wasn't a choice. But to the pastor, it wasn't love. It was sin. It was defiance. Pastor Mitchell didn't act out of impulse. He believed in discipline and order. To him, emotion was weakness, and weakness was sin. That was how he'd lived his life, how he'd raised his son, and how he led his church. So when Ethan confessed, when those words, I love him, passed through his lips, the pastor didn't strike him. He didn't shout or cry. He simply told Ethan to go to his room. We'll talk about this in the morning, he said, his voice cold, distant. Ethan, desperate for hope, believed that maybe his father's silence meant mercy. He obeyed, unsure of what to expect. But Pastor Mitchell didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his study, the Bible open before him, though he didn't read it. The house was silent, but his mind was anything but. He thought about the church. about the congregation that trusted him to lead them, to protect them from sin. He thought about the sermons he had preached, the warnings he had delivered. He had said that the wages of sin were death, that there could be no compromise with temptation. And now, his own son had brought that very corruption into his home. He understood what had to be done. To Pastor Mitchell, this wasn't about love. It was about preserving God's plan. If the people of his church discovered that his son had fallen to temptation, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be an infection. If Ethan, the preacher's son, could fall, then anyone could. The pastor's duty, as he saw it, was not to save his son. It was to save his church, his reputation, to make an example. I've seen men lose themselves to hatred before. Fathers turning their backs on their children, choosing pride over love. But what Pastor Mitchell did went beyond hatred. It was calculation. He made his decision that night. And with the same cold certainty with which he preached every Sunday, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, Ethan woke to his father's voice calling him downstairs. There was no mention of the night before. No anger, no threats, just calm. Pastor Mitchell told Ethan that he wanted to talk. That he understood now. That he was ready to listen. Ethan, hopeful despite everything, believed him. The two of them sat in the living room, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. For a few minutes, they talked. The pastor asked Ethan to explain how long he had felt this way, how it had happened. Ethan, thinking this was his chance to be understood, poured out his heart. He spoke of Caleb, of the love he had tried to suppress for so long. The shame, the fear. And then, finally, the love he couldn't deny. When he finished, he looked at his father, expecting anger, maybe disgust. But instead, he saw something far more terrifying. Emptiness. A cold, hollow absence in Pastor Mitchell's eyes. And then, without a word, he stood. Walked across the room. Locked the front door. I prayed for you last night, he said, his voice eerily calm. I asked God what to do. Without warning, he struck his son. The first blow took Ethan by surprise, knocking him to the floor. The second came faster, before Ethan could react. I often wonder if, in those final moments, Ethan realized his father had never intended to save him. That this wasn't punishment, it was sacrifice. The struggle was brief. Pastor Mitchell wasn't large, but he was strong, and Ethan didn't fight back. Maybe he still believed his father loved him. Maybe he thought if he just endured it, it would stop. But Pastor Mitchell didn't stop. He did what he believed had to be done. By the time the house was silent again, Ethan Mitchell was gone. And Pastor Mitchell, covered in his son's blood, knelt beside the body and prayed. He prayed for forgiveness. He prayed for strength. But most of all, he prayed that his congregation would understand. Because this wasn't just about Ethan. This was a message. A message that sin, no matter where it came from, no matter who it lived inside, would not be tolerated. And so, one night, Ethan ceased to exist, not just as a person, but as a warning. The next Sunday, Pastor Mitchell stood before his congregation, the weight of grief heavy in his voice. But it was not the grief of a father mourning his son, it was the grief of a man who believed he had made a necessary sacrifice to protect the purity of his flock. The church was packed that morning. Whispers had already spread through the town, rumors of Ethan's sudden disappearance, quiet speculations about what might have happened. But when Pastor Mitchell took his place at the pulpit, the murmurs faded into silence. He began with a prayer. His voice was calm, measured, as if he had spent the night rehearsing every word. Brothers and sisters, today I stand before you with a heavy heart. A heart that aches not only for my family, but for the soul of this town, for the soul of this church. His eyes swept across the room, his gaze filled with sorrow, but beneath it, something darker. There are times in life when we are tested, he continued. Times when the trials of this world pierce us from within, from our very own homes. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. They could sense something serious was coming, but they had no idea what. My son, Ethan, Pastor Mitchell's voice wavered for a moment, then steadied. He was lost. He was consumed by a darkness that I could not reach him through. He chose a path that led him far from the truth. He turned away from God. And in the end, he made the decision that no father should ever have to face. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Ethan left us. He swallowed, his voice thick with emotion. He left behind a note. In it, he told us that he could no longer live with the weight of his sins. He said he was going to end his life, that he could not go on. And so, he left the house, disappeared into the night, leaving us with nothing but his words. There was a collective gasp in the congregation. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others clutched at their hearts in sorrow. I did everything I could, Pastor Mitchell said softly, his eyes staring down. I prayed, I begged for his soul. But when someone turns their back on God, there is nothing left to do but let them go. The room fell into a heavy silence as Pastor Mitchell exhaled deeply. His words hung in the air, unchallenged. Ethan is gone, he concluded, his voice steady, unwavering. And with that, he turned the tragedy into a sermon, a cautionary tale of the dangers of sin and temptation. This is what happens when we stray from God, he continued. This is what happens when we give in to the darkness that surrounds us. Ethan was a warning, a reminder that even the most loved ones among us can be led astray. The congregation listened, captivated, many nodding in agreement. The pastor was their guide, their leader. If he said Ethan was lost, they believed it. The note became the perfect tool for the pastor to further solidify his narrative. He had manipulated the town into believing that Ethan's disappearance was a choice, a tragic act of his own will. No one questioned it. And so, the town mourned the loss, not of a victim, but of a soul who had chosen a path of sin. By the time the service ended, Ethan's name began to fade from the minds of the people. His absence was accepted, his fate unquestioned. And Pastor Mitchell, he stood at the door, offering his hand to his flock, accepting their condolences. But deep down, he did not mourn. He had already made peace with his actions. For in his mind, Ethan was never truly his son after he had fallen from grace. And in the pastor's eyes, there was no room for sorrow, only a certainty in the righteousness of his choice. While the town accepted Pastor Mitchell's version of events, one person was not convinced. Caleb had been Ethan's closest friend, and he knew something was wrong. The note, which Pastor Mitchell had described as Ethan's farewell, seemed too convenient, too perfectly fitting with the pastor's narrative. Caleb knew Ethan would never have taken his own life, not without a fight. Ethan had been afraid of his father, yes, but he was also determined and not one to give up easily. Caleb couldn't shake the memory of the last time he saw Ethan, the fear in his eyes when they spoke of Pastor Mitchell's increasing anger and cruelty. Ethan had spoken of wanting to escape, but there was no way to know for sure. Still, Caleb couldn't accept that Ethan had just disappeared without a trace. Something didn't add up. After the sermon, Caleb stayed behind in the church, waiting for the congregation to file out. His eyes never left Pastor Mitchell, who greeted each person with his usual warm smile, completely unruffled. Caleb's suspicion grew. He began to ask quiet questions around town, approaching Ethan's former friends, those who had stopped speaking to him once the rumors about Ethan's disappearance began to circulate. but no one had anything helpful to say. Everyone had moved on, accepting the pastor's words as gospel. Desperate for answers, Caleb visited the Mitchell house at night, watching from a distance. He hoped for some sign, some evidence, but there was nothing. It was as if Ethan had never existed. Frustrated, Caleb finally went to the sheriff. At first, the sheriff dismissed him, citing that people left all the time, and maybe Ethan had simply run away. But Caleb persisted, refusing to back down. He told the sheriff about the bruises he had seen on Ethan, the way he spoke about his father, not with love, but with fear. The sheriff reluctantly agreed to launch a quiet investigation, but Pastor Mitchell's reputation was so solid, no one had expected the truth to come to light. However, as the investigation progressed, the whispers of the pastor's cruelty and control grew louder. One night, the sheriff's department visited the Mitchell house for a thorough search. At first, Pastor Mitchell welcomed them with open arms, guiding them through the house with a calm and collected demeanor. But when they went to the backyard and opened the door to the shed, they made the discovery that would shatter the town's faith in their pastor forever. There, buried beneath the floorboards, they found Ethan's body. Wrapped in a sheet, hidden but not forgotten. The town's collective horror was palpable. The preacher who had once held such power over them was now a murderer, a man who had used his faith to justify his son's death. The trial of Pastor Mitchell was unlike any the town had ever seen. No longer was he the figure of unwavering righteousness. Now, he sat in the defendant's chair, his hands cuffed, his eyes forward. The courtroom was packed with townsfolk, reporters, and the families of the victims. They had all come to witness the downfall of the man who had once been seen as a moral compass, but now stood accused of unspeakable crimes. The prosecution wasted no time. They presented the evidence, photos of Ethan, bruised and broken. Testimonies from those who had witnessed Pastor Mitchell's abusive behavior. The most damning of all was Caleb's testimony. He spoke of Ethan's fear, the way he had tried to survive under his father's oppressive rule. He recounted their conversations, how Ethan had longed for a way out but had never truly believed it would come. Pastor Mitchell, sitting stoically at the defense table, showed no remorse. His voice, when it was his turn to speak, was firm and unwavering. "I did what had to be done," he said. "I saved him. I saved this town from the sin that had taken root in my own house. Ethan's soul was lost. I was only doing what any true believer would do." The jury listened, but the evidence was clear. Ethan had not died because of sin. He had died because his father's twisted faith had led him to take his life. The conviction was inevitable. When the verdict came, it was unanimous: guilty. Pastor Mitchell's face remained impassive, even as the gavel slammed down. He was sentenced to life in prison, but there were no tears. No protests. As he was led away in handcuffs, past the faces of those who had once trusted him, Pastor Mitchell did not flinch. In his mind, he had already won. He had proven to himself that his faith was unshakable, even if no one else believed it. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.